Hey, I want to welcome everyone to this live webinar with Exponential and Discipleship.org. I'm Todd Wilson, the CEO of Exponential, and I am thrilled to have with me today a close friend, Bobby Harrington. Bobby is the CEO of Discipleship.org. Discipleship.org champions Jesus' style of disciple making. They have over 30 national partners that they aggregate, curate, and distribute disciple making resources. We like to say at Exponential, the way we're kind of the Chamber of Commerce for church planting, Discipleship.org is the Chamber of Commerce for disciple making. They're not in competition with anybody, but just champion all the resources that are out there. Bobby, through Discipleship.org, they distribute resources. They have multiple forums a year. They have an upcoming forum in Phoenix that's going to be an all virtual online with what we have going on in our world right now. Bobby is also the point leader at Harpeth Christian Church in Franklin, Tennessee, and he's a leader at renew.org. Bobby has trained hundreds of church planting leaders, passionate about the church. He's quite a networker, and he is one of the most passionate people I know about disciple making. So there's nobody better to have on today than Bobby to talk with us on this national study on disciple making. So welcome, Bobby.
Todd, it's great to be with you. You described the mission of Discipleship.org, which is championing Jesus-style disciple making, like you actually helped co-found it, which of course you did. So I'm really pleased to be on here with you, close friend, a close collaborator, and grateful for the partnership that Discipleship.org has with Exponential.
Yeah. You know, Bobby, you and I have spent some really cool time in a lot of places, from Israel to other places. Of all the places I've been with you in, I have never been in this cozy cottage that you're finding yourself in right now.
Todd, with the coronavirus pandemic right now, I'd like you to envision me off in a cabin, all isolated, able to fish from the back. The only problem is it's a virtual background. So we'll just
I'm glad you're with us. Hey, let's jump in and talk about this national study on disciple making. This study was just published after a whole lot of work went into it. Can you just tell us a little bit about the heart behind this study? Before we jump into the details of the study, just tell us a little bit about the heart behind it, why we're doing it, and just the process of pulling it together.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Todd. So as you know, we champion Jesus-style disciple making, and we think it's super important. And so the question is, when you're wanting to champion Jesus-style disciple making, and our vision is the day when disciple making movements become the norm in homes, in communities, in churches and ministries, we literally see this revolution of disciple making. It's really important that we think of where we're at right now. I love Exponential's vision of influencing 16% of churches. Well, to be reproducing or multiplying churches. Our vision is similar. We look forward to the day, if we can get to 16% of homes, of communities, of churches and ministries committed to Jesus-style disciple making, it's really going to transform many millions of lives. So before we get there, though, we got to know where we're at. Where are we at in terms of disciple making with churches? So the study was an attempt to define reality and find out the state of disciple making in the North American church.
And Bobby, just, there's a whole lot of studies and surveys and different things out there. Give us a little bit of perspective on what went into this study. Was this just a poll of 100 pastors out there? Was this something you did one weekend? What's the background behind how you did this?
Yeah, again, that's a good question. So we partnered with you, Exponential. Discipleship.org partnered with Exponential, and we entered into an arrangement with a professional research firm that works for Lifeway and many other organizations called Gray Matters. And they did a professional survey that is supposed to be within 3% accuracy, where they interviewed on the phone over 1,000 pastors of churches in North America.
Great. And so this is a statistic, I mean, this is done by a professional firm. So it's something that we have to pay attention to the results, I guess, is kind of the key there. Um, what, at Exponential, we use a level 5 framework for level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 churches, with level 5 being multiplying. And you've embraced a similar framework that kind of is sort of what went into this study. Talk a little bit about that framework, just as we start to bring the results of the study to life.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, Todd. So the framework is really important both for individual disciple making as well as disciple making churches. We've embraced the same framework. In fact, about over 3 years ago, Greg Wines and I wrote an ebook that we feature both on discipleship.org and on Exponential. And that's Becoming a Disciple Maker. And the subtitle is The Pursuit of Level 5 Disciple Making. So Todd, just because the framework is so important, if you don't mind, I'll take just a minute. I want to explain very briefly the individual disciple maker assessment and then the church assessment.
That's
and
great.
I want people to know that on both the individual and the church, we have online surveys where discipleship.org and Exponential have partnered, and you can go and get an assessment of yourself as an individual and also of the church. In fact, if we can get Brooks to post that for the individual assessment up there, that'd be really important. So I'm just gonna talk through very quickly each of the 5 frameworks. So first off is level 1. And again, as an individual, if I'm looking and I want to assess myself as an individual, I want to find out, am I a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? And it's simply math applied to disciple making. Okay, so some people, because maybe they could be heretics, maybe there's somebody who's abandoning the faith themselves. Some people are actually causing the subtraction of disciples through teaching heresy, through other factors. They would be level 1. So it's a negative. Then number 2 would be plateauing. It's a person who neither helps people to be disciples nor they discourage them from being disciples. They're just literally neutral. The way things are, they're causing a plateau. Level 3, a level 3 disciple maker person is going to be that man or woman in a local church who's usually doing all the work. They're serving in Sunday school. They're helping in the band. They're showing up to be a greeter. They tithe. They do all they can to support the disciple making of a church. We call them spiritual adults in most churches. Level 4 is going to be somebody who personally makes disciples. Maybe they make disciples in a small group. Maybe they meet with a group of friends from the community and they disciple them. Like my wife meets every Tuesday with a group of women that she is discipling and investing in their lives. They are personal disciple makers. Now, I just want to pause here for a second, because a lot of people think that is the ultimate goal. It's to reproduce disciples individually, which is level 4. But let me ask this question. Did Jesus make disciples, or did Jesus make disciple makers? And the answer is actually Jesus made disciple makers, because what happened is that Jesus' final command is the Great Commission, where he commissioned those he had made disciples of to go forth and make disciples of others themselves. So level 5, it's described in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. It's where we are not just making disciples, but disciple makers. Paul describes himself that way in 2 Timothy 2, verse 2, where he says to Timothy, that which you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, that would be generation 1. Paul, he says to Timothy, that which you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who are able to teach others. So you see 4 generations of disciples. Paul to Timothy, Timothy to reliable people, and reliable people to others. That is the quintessential mark of a level 5 personal disciple maker. They can tell you 4 generations of disciples. Now, let me just pause there for a second, and I'm going to go and describe the 5 levels of a church. Todd, did you want to jump in before I
No, that's great, Bobby.
about the church?
That's great.
Okay. So, a level 1 church is a church, maybe they've embraced heresy, maybe they become so progressive that they're actually abandoning the gospel. The church is causing the subtraction of disciples of Jesus. For example, it's what you saw when Islam took over places like Saudi Arabia and that 13 centuries ago. And it's happening in many places today. Level 2 is a church, and it's just holding its own. It's neither causing the loss of disciples, nor is it adding disciples. It's in a plateau mode. A level 3 church is a church where by their programs, notice my wording, by their programs, they're adding disciples. Typically, a level 3 church emphasizes the preacher and preaching. I consider that one thing. Preaching, programs, and praise and worship. And historically, and when I say historically, over the last 30 years, the church with the best preacher, programs, and praise and worship would tend to draw the biggest numbers of people. And they would convert people. They would add disciples, but they weren't reproducing disciples. Everything was dependent on the church, which leads to level 4 churches. And we're going to find out there's less than 5% of them. Level 4 churches have created disciple-making cultures, and they are reproducing disciples and disciple makers. So it's where you have somebody who is a disciple of Jesus, and they draw to themselves a group of other people. They become disciples, or they become a part of the group, and then that group reproduces other groups that reproduce other groups, and disciple makers are made. And then a level 5 church. And to tip my hat, we couldn't find any here in North America. A level 5 church is multiplying disciples and disciple makers. So level 5 churches, the disciple making culture is viral. And you would have to work to stop it from reproducing disciples and disciple makers. And it always results in the planting of new churches. So I'll stop there.
I think, Bobby, the way that was a great description, kind of mathematically, the way we talk about it at Exponential, especially the difference between level 3, level 4, and level 5. Most churches in America have become conditioned, whether it's through the lists of the fastest growing churches, the largest churches, the most innovative churches. We've embraced a scorecard that really is at the level 3 addition growth side. And in order to fuel that addition mindset, that's where our programs that you're talking about fit in. It's very much in the U.S. church a programmatic approach. Here's how we say it mathematically at Exponential. If I've got one finger up and I bring a second finger, so I've got 2, I've added one finger plus one finger is 2. That's addition. I have not reproduced the first finger. I've actually added to the first finger. That's what level 3 addition is. At level 3, the way we're adding is we're programmatically not having the first one reproduce itself, but we're doing programs and doing things to add a second. And what's really key about what you said, in Jesus' style of disciple making, the way we do the addition is actually through reproduction. A disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple. The way we're adding when we're at level 4 is we're actually adding by reproducing. And we just have to embrace this mathematically. You can add without reproducing. That's the programmatic approach. But you cannot reproduce without adding. People have to get their head around that. You can add without reproducing, but you can't reproduce without adding. That's why level 4 is so important. How we add makes all the difference. And then level 5, the multiplication part, you said it, that it's reproduction to the 4th generation. A disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple. If we keep adding by reproduction 4 generations into the future, the resulting curve that we get is an exponential curve. It's a multiplication curve. We naturally get the multiplication as an outcome. The key out of all that, though, is how do we add? That's why it comes back to the importance of Jesus' style of disciple making. If we're not adding by disciples who make disciples, we will never see the multiplication movements that we want to see. So we're thrilled that you've embraced and used that framework that way. Let's jump into this study, Bobby. So,
hey, Todd, before we do that, there's a question in the Q&A box, if I can just tackle it, because it's vital for our conversation.
Yeah.
When we say Jesus-style disciple making, the question is, what does that mean? And of course, in the book, we refer to it. I want to give a short definition and then refer people to a longer definition, but I want to use these words. Jesus-style disciple making is, number one, it's intentional. Robert Coleman, when he wrote about Jesus' method, called it the master plan of evangelism, which we would use the language of the master plan that Jesus had for making disciples. We tend not to use the word evangelism as much as they did, 50 years ago when Robert Coleman wrote the book. So the first thing is that it's intentional. It's highly thoughtful. It's not the wasting of effort. It's intentional. It's relational. And what's so important about Jesus' method, he invited his disciples into a relationship with himself and the others. So it's intentional, relational, disciple making. Those words are super important, and we can come back to that. The best way to understand, if you've never thought this through before, how did Jesus make disciples? I would encourage you, you can go to discipleship.org, download the free ebook there. It's called Revisiting the Master Plan of Evangelism. And Robert Coleman lays out the, used to be 8 principles, but he would add a 9th in terms of Jesus' method of disciple making. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Bobby. So let's jump into this study. Let me ask you this, I'm going to have you unpack the top findings, Bobby. Let me ask you those as we get in. Were you surprised by the results of this study?
Yeah. So on the one hand, I wasn't surprised, but on the other hand, I was disappointed. So here's what I mean by that. I already knew from many years working with Exponential, Todd, through you, I've had the privilege of being the chief advocate of disciple making and the disciple making tracks at Exponential from the beginning. And then I've had the privilege of working with a lot of national organizations. And we're all very aware that disciple making, Jesus-style disciple making is not the norm. So on the one hand, the stats didn't surprise me. I hope they'd be a little better. But the thing that discouraged me is one of the results. So why don't I go in and give the high level on the results and then tell you what discouraged me a little bit.
Great.
So at a high level, here are the 4 results that we found. First, fewer than 5% of churches in the U.S. have a reproducing disciple-making culture. We'd already anticipated that. Second, there's an absence of churches that reflect, and I want to say this well, that reflect viral-like disciple-making movements. My friend Jim Putman had said when we're saying that there aren't disciple-making movement churches in the U.S., many people make the mistake of thinking, well, there's not disciple-making churches. No, there's about 5% disciple-making churches. But if you look around the world, there's about 1,000 disciple-making movements, and the character traits of those movements we could not find in churches in the United States. In disciple-making movements, the churches that characterize those movements would be level 5 churches. Number 3 is a lack of commonly understood definitions. This is the part, coupled with the next one, that discouraged me. And what it is that disciple making, or discipleship. And we tried to be very careful about our language, that it was disciple making and Jesus style disciple making. But what we realized is that pastors and leaders use those definitions to mean anything and ultimately everything, which leads to it means nothing. Because if everything's disciple making, then nothing is really disciple making, at least in terms of that which Jesus did. And in the process, we learned that pastors are overestimating. If everything the church does is disciple making, then you're overstating it, and you're overstating your impact, and it leads to a real nebulous vision of what Jesus did and abdicating for what Jesus did.
So Bobby, we
got to redefine everything.
Let me just on that point clarify, and we'll go back and go into more detail on each one of these though. But I think if I understand right, what you're saying is it's very easy, pastors who have a 24/7 ministry lifestyle, it's very easy to see everything you do through the lens of disciple making or discipleship, or at least to perceive it that way. You could consider the 5, 10, 15 hours a week that you do sermon preps, even though it's isolated to yourself, it's not meeting the relational part of it necessarily. The prep time you do for meetings, the time you're in board meetings with the elders, the time you're in staff meetings, it's very easy for a pastor to see almost anything they do through the lens of thinking it's disciple making. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah. So to be fair, you've got to do meetings. You've got to have leadership meetings. You got to have board meetings. You got to have business meetings. You got to have tactical, logistical things anytime you have a church that's doing disciple making. But what happens is when you define that, all of those things as Jesus style disciple making, you've made Jesus style disciple making mean much broader than what it really means. And so if you are narrowly focused on doing what Jesus did with his disciples, which some scholars estimates anywhere from 65 to 90% of his time, then if you're using that, how did Jesus do it? Are we doing what Jesus did? How can we quantify and measure ourselves against that? Then that's the kind of metric that we were hoping and shooting to achieve.
So I'm gonna go ahead and follow up on that, and we will jump back to the findings. But so what do you say? If we start with Jesus, you could argue that it was hard to separate his quote business meetings with the disciples or his meetings from the relational disciple making activity you're talking about. So if a pastor says to you, yeah, Bobby, I hear what you're saying, but I consider the time I'm in staff meetings, catching up with my staff every week, how's that different than what Jesus did with the disciples? Why isn't that? Or the time I spend with my elders in the elder meeting, how's that different than what Jesus was doing?
Yeah, this is a nuance, and we got to be careful not to overstate things here.
Yep.
Because, when you're talking about the big, broad perspective on Jesus style disciple making, but what we tried to do in the study is have very exact measurements of the amount of time that you are spending directly in relationship for the purpose of disciple making versus the administrative meetings that you would have. So we sought to do that. The problem was that the definitions that we gave were blurred over just by generic concepts of discipleship, which is a different concept than Jesus' style of intentional, relational disciple making.
And to keep it, just as practical as possible, Bobby, if I start with that definition of sort of level 5, we want to be level 5 disciple makers, and that's to the 4th generation. So is it safe to say that an individual could analyze their own time and energy, how they spend their time, and is it roughly lining up that if someone tracked their spiritual lineage, where they've made a disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple, that number one, if we really are doing the Jesus style of disciple making, you're going to be able to track that spiritual lineage. Like someone's going to be able to say, I made this disciple who made this disciple who made the disciple, number one. And number two, now if I look at how I spend my time, you're talking right now about those activities of time that you can directly affiliate with that spiritual lineage of seeing John become a disciple who made a disciple of Bill, who made a disciple of Mark, is that what you're saying? That the
I think
time allocation lines up with that spiritual lineage, that you can actually put your time allocation to individual disciples.
Yeah, I think you're on the right track there with what you're saying, Todd. Let's just talk about the end result, because when you go to bed at night and you're saying, have I really made disciples the way Jesus made disciples? You're going to want to look 4 generations deep. In other words, okay, this is somebody I invested in for a set period of years. Who are they now discipling? And can I get a sense of who the person they discipled is discipling? In disciple-making movements, 2 Timothy 2:2 is really important as a key metric because it has that 4 generations. Now, in a disciple-making movement, you're going to look at a church and you're going to see multiple streams 4 generations deep. Now, if you back that up and you say, okay, if that's the end goal, is that we would see God use us. The idea is that my fruit grows on other people's trees. If that's what we're going to see to 4 generations in multiple streams, what is it that I need to be doing today by following the way Jesus made disciples with people, and I would argue that who know they're going to go and make disciples, so that I'm organizing my life on a daily basis to make sure that I am discipling people that way in a replicatable model, so that they will go out and do it with others. And how do I quantify that? Well, in level 4 churches, you're finding that the people in those churches, 25 to 50% are actually engaged on an ongoing basis in Jesus-style discipling relationships with the end goal of raising up people who are true disciples. And as a part of being a true disciple, they go and make disciples. When you're a part of a disciple-making movement, the numbers go higher. So jump in here, Todd, because I want to make sure I'm addressing this.
So let me summarize. You gave 4 top findings here: that less than 5% of U.S. churches are at level 4 or 5, reproducing, multiplying. That there was an absence of finding churches that were reflecting viral-like disciple making that could produce level 5. There's a lack of commonly understood terms and definitions, and pastors are tending to overestimate what their disciple making activities are. So let's go back through those and unpack the, is there anything more on each one of those that you want to, the 5% of churches, is there anything more you want to press into there? And we do have a question from people. What are the characteristics of level 5? Like if you were looking at those 1,000 DMMs or some churches around the world that are exhibiting level 5, what are some of those characteristics that would distinguish them?
Yeah, so let me go ahead and share some of those with you. They are in the report. So I just want to say that it's in the report on page 14, but let me just hit a couple of high levels of those. And I'm going to try to highlight some things that are not the norm of North American churches. And by the way, just a little bit of background on like, how do we know these things? So there's a couple of filters that are really helpful. The first filter is just, it's simply math. Like there's a difference between things being added, things being reproduced, and then things being multiplied, okay? So the first filter is math. The second is experts like Jerry Trousdale of New Generations and Final Command spent time talking to Jerry. Thirdly, and probably most importantly, spent a lot of time with Shadonke Johnson, one of the world's leading practitioners and leaders of disciple-making movements. And then thirdly, on the field investigation of those churches. In fact, if people are interested, we have a 20-minute video presentation by my friend David Young, who summarized for a partner network, Renew.org, in 20 minutes, his observation of the disciple-making movement associated with Shadonke Johnson. But here are some of the things that stand out and are really different than churches in North America. The first off is fasting and praying. I mean, they fast and pray a couple of times a week, and they have special fasting and prayer, on a regular basis. Secondly, the core leadership teams are committed not just to making disciples, but making disciple makers. So the question is not, are you making disciples? The question with staff is, who are the disciple makers that you've empowered that are making disciples and planting churches? For example, some of these disciple-making movements will have conferences, and you can't come to the conference unless you have launched, at least 5 churches, because your disciples make disciples that plant churches. In these churches, here's another character trait. The disciples in these churches, they think that everybody's supposed to make disciples and plant churches. They don't even think the way we think. They think that being a disciple means you're going to follow Jesus and make disciples. So over 90% of people, when you ask, this is so funny because I asked Shadonke, are you saying everybody makes disciples? And he frowned and he said, yes, everybody's making disciples, because that's the thing. Another thing that they have taught, and this is what I call a micro disciple making skill, but these churches are characterized by, and I'm going to use 3 words here that are really important: a simple, effective, and reproducible method of making disciples. And typically, it's discovery Bible study. So if you want David Young's presentation, and if you want to know a little bit more about Discovery Bible Study, if you'll send an email to info@renew.org, there's some specific materials on that. But let me stop there and make sure I'm answering that question, Todd.
No, that's good, Bobby. We've got a lot of questions coming in, so I'll keep us moving so we can get to a little bit of Q&A. One thing before we move on from the findings, give an example or two, the finding that there's a lack of commonly understood definitions. Give us an example or two, and then highlight why, that to some people can sound like not a big deal, but highlight an example or two and explain why that's a really big deal.
Yeah, the first one is actually kind of hard for me to say, because I have ambivalence about it. As the leader of Discipleship.org, one of the problems is the word discipleship, because the word discipleship itself is not in the Bible, and it just simply means the state of being a disciple. So that's like technically what it means, but it commonly means, discipleship can commonly mean I'm studying, and we have discipleship classes where you study the Bible. So it's typically associated with Bible study. Now, sometimes it's associated with what Jesus did, but it's one of those words that the definitions on it are so broad that when somebody says I'm into discipleship, I don't know what that means. I had a guy who leads this international ministry, and he said to me, hey, I need some discipleship material. And what he meant by that is I need Bible study curriculum. And so that's a symptom of a difficulty. We prefer the term now disciple making, because number one, the words in the Bible, make disciples or disciple making, and there's a context, and that's the way Jesus did it. And so we gravitate that way. That's one example.
And if I could just say that back to you. So if discipleship is not really a word in the Bible, and its meaning is the state of being, that plays right to, it's more about what I receive, which plays to the consumerism of church. It's more about a receiving, which then plays to the programs of Sunday school and all the other things. Whereas disciple making flips it around. It's about what I'm giving. It's the action of giving, not the state of being or receiving. Is that?
Yeah, disciple making tends to be more proactive. Let me tell you another reason why this is important. Typically, and Bill Hall and I wrote a book on this called Evangelism or Discipleship. And it gets at this. A lot of people think that you have this thing called evangelism, and you do evangelism and somebody's converted, and then you do discipleship, which is helping them to become like Christ, or people use the word sanctification. And so you bifurcate and you say evangelism is one thing, discipleship is another. And the truth is, Jesus didn't do it that way. Not only does the Bible not have the word discipleship, the Bible doesn't have the word evangelism. Now, I know it's got preach the gospel, euangelion, but typically that's not certainly what Jesus did. And one of the ways I say that is this: Jesus was making disciples of his disciples before his disciples were converted. Or stated in another way, in Jesus' disciple making with the disciples, when were they converted? Have fun with that question. So disciple making begins with reaching people who don't know Jesus. My friend Alex Absalom says disciple making begins at hello. So it begins with connecting and building relationships with lost people, and it ends with now go and make disciples as I've made a disciple of you. So it's from evangelism all the way to reproduction and multiplication.
Great. Well, Bobby, let's turn our eyes to the future here. So less than 5% of churches are reproducing, which means in the way we've laid it out, if you're not reproducing, you're not going to be multiplying. Reproduction Jesus way is the core mechanism for multiplication and movement. So what we're talking about right now is less than 5% of churches are reproducing or multiplying, which means 95% of churches are not in a position to multiply. So turn to the future, what are the recommendations then coming out of this? If I'm a pastor that's one of those less than 5% of churches, what are you telling me I need to latch onto at this point to position our church, not overnight, but just to start moving our church the direction that we have the ability to have a reproducing culture that can multiply?
Yeah, so here we are. This is being recorded just as the coronavirus pandemic is hitting the United States. And this question is so relevant because a friend of mine put it to me this way last week. It's a guy with a church in Cincinnati that I've been coaching. And he said to me, he said, Bobby, I don't know what churches are going to be doing right now if all they were doing is focusing on Sunday morning programming. Because right now, like, you can't compete. The average church is not going to compete with Elevation Worship or Elevation Church, or we could list a whole bunch of churches with their online platforms. But what people are not getting is personal connections. And it's those churches that have already fully swung into disciple making, and now they've adapted and they're making disciples online who are really, I think that they're going to do a lot better, certainly over the next few months. And I think even longer than that, because afterwards, I think a lot of people are going to start evaluating their relationship with churches. So if I were to give you 4 things, high level, and then Todd, you can have me drill down on any one of them. The first thing I would start doing personally, which is not listed in the report, but I would do first, is I would personally be making disciples. We have this expression, you can't lead where you don't go, you can't teach what you don't know, and you can't give to others what you can't show as a disciple of Jesus in your own life. So I just think there is no replacement for, first and foremost, everybody who's on this webinar. If we are disciples of Jesus, we need to be making disciples of Jesus to influence others to make disciples of Jesus. And there's some great resources. Discipleship.org has all these partners, and I just want to encourage you first and foremost to get in the game. Both men and women make disciples. My wife, I'm so proud of my wife for many things, but one of the things is these ladies that she's discipling. Just to see her pouring into women 30 years younger than her and discipling them and connecting with them every day and helping them. So I want to start by being a disciple who makes disciples. The second thing that we need to do as church leaders is champion clear definitions and commonly understood language. We want to make sure if we're trying to make disciples that we have a definition of a disciple. And again, the report lists these definitions. They're also posted on discipleship.org. You go to the About tab, there's a list of definitions there. Number 3, senior pastors must embrace disciple making as the core mission of the local church. I did a webinar earlier this morning on Discovery Bible Study, and I was asking the question, are there any churches that have more people in disciple making through Discovery Bible Study than this one church that had 500 people? And they couldn't think of anybody. And I'd asked that because I had stated that, and then I realized, well, maybe I'm not right about that. And one of the guys pointed out there was a church that had 2,000 people in Discovery Bible Study, effectively using it and reaching people, but then the senior pastor changed and the church totally dropped it. Here's the reality. The senior pastor is the most influential person in any church. And before a church can make a shift, the senior pastor has to make the shift and embrace the concept that Jesus-style disciple making is the core mission of the local church. Number 4, we need to develop new measures of success. In other words, what's the scorecard? It's no longer going to be bodies, bucks, and buildings, but 4 generations of disciples, disciple makers, and the fruit of Jesus-like obedience and reproduction. And then number 5, champion effective strategies and models. For it to become a part of a culture, again, you have to have that simple, effective, reproducible model, and the culture itself needs to be transformed. Todd, I'm going to mention a book. There's a guy named Brandon Gindin coming out with a book on a disciple-making culture that does a great job on the question of culture, which both you and I know is a big deal. So again, I'll pause and you jump in.
I think let's do 2 things, Bobby. If I can go back to the language again, let's pretend for a minute that you're starting a new church. You get the benefit of starting brand new right now.
Amen.
What are this language issue, the definitions? What are the 2 or 3 or 4 words? And you don't have to go into detail on each one, but just to give people sort of a head start here, what are the words you would make sure are consistently built into your culture and very clear?
Yeah. Excuse me. And I have to give credit to Jim Putman on this first one. Years ago, Jim Putman gathered together a group of national leaders, or actually he didn't gather them together. They were gathered together by some guys who are famous guys. I won't mention their names because it was a bad experience. They all came together, and what happened is they didn't even have simple definitions. They wanted to champion in North America disciple making, but they couldn't even agree on, like, what is a disciple or what is disciple making, and the thing didn't work. So with discipleship.org, and Todd, you were a key part of that. The first thing that we did is we got together with the leaders of national disciple making organizations, and we agreed on definitions that we're using. So I believe Brooks put the link there, or Chris did, under the About tab at discipleship.org. So we ask everybody who works with us to refer to, and where possible, use common definitions. So if I was planting a church again, and I was really committed, as I would be, to it being a disciple-making church. And by the way, the funny thing about planting a church, and you know this, Todd, when you plant a church, it's your own DNA. Now that's a good thing for the most part, except you might plant DNA that you're not so aware of. I planted a church years ago, and then realized it wasn't focused on disciple making and sought to do a DNA redo, and it's much harder. But here's the thing. You start off with, what is a disciple? And you want everybody to know, here's what a disciple is. This is the animal, or this is the target. This is the animal we're hunting for. This is the target. This is what we want. So a disciple, based on Matthew 4:19, we use that as a framework, is somebody who's following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, and is committed to the mission of Jesus. So in the invitation, we can see everybody at every state where they're starting to follow, they're being changed, and finally they're living out the mission of Jesus. Well, what is disciple making as a second definition? Disciple making is entering into relationships intentionally, entering into relationships to intentionally help people follow Jesus, be changed by Jesus, and become committed to the mission of Jesus. And so using all those definitions, and the folks have put them on the screen, gives you an idea. I'll just do the third definition. A disciple maker is a disciple of Jesus who enters in relationships with people to intentionally, and that word intentionality is probably the single most important word next to the person of Jesus in disciple making. So enters into relationships with people to intentionally help them follow Jesus, be changed by Jesus, and join the mission of Jesus.
Great. So Bobby, one of your recommendations was that importance of the lead pastor and the role they play. And your recommendation was that the lead pastor must embrace disciple making as the core mission of the church.
Yeah.
And here's the question. Back on the problem findings, the combination of definitions and pastors overinflating things. If you and I did a survey right now of 100 pastors and ask how many of them is disciple making the core mission of the church, 95 out of 100 or more are going to say it is. So give us the distinction.
Todd, let me just say something. And you're the smartest guy I know, so I don't want to disagree with you. I don't think most pastors, in my experience, are clear about that. Kevin DeYoung wrote a book 9 years ago called "What is the Mission of the Church?" because I think that is really fuzzy with a lot of people. So
okay, so let's ask the question this way: for pastors who would say or think that they do have disciple making at the core, or for the ones that are just uncertain about it, what does it look like functionally to have disciple making as the core mission of the church? How's that differ for a church that does compared to one that doesn't?
Okay, that's good. It makes all the difference in the world. So the first thing is it starts with me. Am I personally making disciples the way Jesus did? Because I want to be what I want the church to be. So I want to know who are my 3 who are like a Peter, James, and John, and who are my 12. Then with those who are in leadership in my church, who are their 3, who are their 12? I believe the local church should have elders. So, who are the elders in relationship, disciple making? The key question becomes, how are we replicating Jesus style disciple making? So on a practical basis, it's our personal engagement in the mission of Jesus every day. And then let's just use simple things, because the question, and as you know, Todd, this came out in the study for level 4 and level 5, every decision of what the church does and how the church spends its money passes through the filter of, how does this help us to make disciples the way Jesus did? So for example, are we going to get involved in the soup kitchen? Well, the way to answer that question is, in getting involved in the soup kitchen, does it help us to make disciples of Jesus? And I would answer, yes, it can, if we're being very intentional that part of following Jesus is caring about the poor as Jesus did. So me and my disciples should be going to the soup kitchen if that's one of the things we elect to do. But I'm going to be doing it with the goal of disciple making. so that when we go to the soup kitchen, I'm talking to the guys that I'm going with before we go there, or afterwards I'm debriefing and just trying to help them to think the way Jesus does about this kind of thing. Let me give you maybe a more practical example. Right now, I'm just finishing the final year of 3 years of really investing in our worship leader. And one of the things that I've constantly been trying to help him to see is how he's going to create a disciple making. We've already got it, but how he can better the disciple making culture of our worship arts ministry. So, who's he discipling? How's he making sure that all the musicians and the singers are in discipling relationships? And how can he raise up other disciple making people in that ministry? So, Todd, maybe get more specific if I'm not being
No,
specific.
that's good, Bobby. And again, practically, when you go back to a bunch of those decisions, the everyday decisions, do we take out a mortgage to do the new building? Do we hire the new middle school pastor? If we take all those operational questions that churches are faced with all the time, I think what I hear you saying is maybe our default motivation for answering a lot of those questions is built around growth. How's this going to help us reach more people or grow numerically? The subtle distinction you're making is that's not a good enough answer. It's got to press into not just can this help us grow or be an accelerator to growth, but how does this help us make disciples relationally Jesus way?
Yes. Let me just say it this way. I think it's really all about love. Like I've had so many conversations over the years. And so I want to ask people to think about, what does it mean to really love somebody the way Jesus did? And the related question is, what does it mean to become more and more like Jesus? You know, in a lot of circles today, Todd, people are talking about spiritual formation, which is the spiritual process by which we get formed more and more into the image of Jesus. And a lot of spiritual formation conversations somehow make the mistake of not realizing that the more you become like Jesus, the more you're going to do what Jesus did. And so the more I become like Jesus, I'm going to love people the way Jesus did. And what's the most loving thing that we could do for somebody? Well, I don't think it's the only thing, but at the end of the day, when we all stand before God at the end of time for the final judgment, we want to help everybody that we can to have placed their faith and their life in the hands of Jesus, and then sought to form their lives around the person of Jesus, becoming more and more like him. Like, that's what God wants for somebody. And if I love somebody, I want them to find salvation, and I want them to become more and more like Jesus, to live the life Jesus would live if he were living their life in their bodies. So it really becomes about people, and it's about loving people and helping them to be what God wants them to be, and their lives to end up being conformed to the image of Jesus.
Great. We've had a lot of questions, Bobby. Let me jump into a few of them before we get off here. A number of people, you've talked about discovery Bible studies. Can you just give the short, for someone who doesn't know what discovery Bible studies are, what is a discovery Bible study?
Yeah, I'll try to give a short definition. A discovery Bible study is a series of about 8 questions that you use in a group environment for any passage of Scripture. If you do a Google search on Discovery Bible Study, you can find out more about that. But it's a series of 8 questions. It's really a great model for reaching people who don't know Jesus, because they discover what the Bible says for themselves.
Bobby, what I'm seeing and hearing right now, while this Corona impact is happening, with a lot of churches having to go online and move their small groups to online, I think a growing number of churches are using the Discovery Bible Study because of the simplicity and reproducibility of anybody can lead it, just about. So it seems like there's more of it happening at this point.
Well, we did that webinar, and again, and I hope this is okay, but just send us an email at info@renew.org, and we'll send you the 2-hour recording. We had these experts talking about it.
Yeah, so that was an entire webinar on the Discovery Bible Study. So I would encourage
how to
people.
do
That was
Discovery Bible Study online, like you're
yeah,
saying.
info@renew.org if you want to get the link for that.
Yeah.
You've talked, Bobby, about us needing a new scorecard in the church. So, you know, if everybody already sort of has embraced the budgets and the butts in seats and the normal baptism statistics, what does the new scorecard look like? If you're starting a new church right now, what's on your scorecard to really create a level 4 or 5 disciple making culture?
Yeah, I think when you're a church planter, as a church planter, you want to raise up leaders to multiply the mission of Jesus. And so the scorecard becomes, again, you're looking for people who are making disciples, who make disciples, that ultimately, I think, Todd, you and Brett Andrews, I think Brett came up with this. Sometimes I get confused, but it's disciples who make disciples that plant churches that make disciples. And so the new metrics are going to be, I always want to say love, because I just got to say this. This is worth even going a little late on. It is not about numbers, and it's not even about multiplication of numbers or reproduction. It's about people being loved into the love of God, because it's loving God and loving people, and that's what disciples are, and disciple makers are. We're creating more and more people who love God and love people, and so it's a multiplication metric of those who are captured by the mission of Jesus, who they want to be disciples in all of life, and they want to make other disciples to bless the lives of others and bless the lives of others. So the scorecard is not who can I get to come and hear me, it's who can I invest in so they can go out and multiply the mission of Jesus.
Yeah, that's really good, Bobby. A number of people are asking, you referred to Brandon Ginden's new book on creating a disciple-making culture.
Yeah,
what's the name of that book? And tell a little bit more about where do you get it and what's the name of it?
Yeah, so I'm just going to put it on the screen. It doesn't come out till the end of April, but I want people to be aware of it. It's going to be at discipleship.org. We're trying to, as you at Exponential champion books, Todd, and been so grateful for you championing the discipleship stuff we're doing. I'm trying to help our team stay on the cutting edge of the best in disciple making. And Brandon Ginden, excuse me, was an executive pastor with Jim Putman as they created one of the model disciple making churches in the country. And there are several, so theirs was one. But then Brandon went to Texas and planted from scratch a church. And this is the first book that I know of where planting a church from scratch with the goal of a disciple-making culture. And after 4 years, they're a level 4 church and reaching a lot of people. And this is just a great book that describes that. So it'll be published in partnership, discipleship.org and HIM Publications. And by the end of April, it'll be published and people can learn more about it. We'll do a flip book on this book as well, Todd.
Good. And Bobby, I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit to say we have a ton of really good questions that have come in that we're not going to get to. I'm going to encourage, what if you were to take the list of these questions and on discipleship.org's website, use these to do a blog post or something that actually addresses a bunch of these questions. And that would be over at discipleship.org, a blog post coming out by Bobby.
I will make the following commitment. I'm going to do my best to answer them. So
yes.
If you get them to me, I'll do my best to answer them next week.
Yeah. And we don't have to put an exact, I know how busy you are with the things that are going on, but I'll have people be looking for it at some point in the future. You'll take a stab at some number of them. There's a bunch of them that you'll have no problem answering. So Bobby, tell us here as we're getting ready to get off. I alluded at the beginning to the upcoming forum, Disciple Making Forum. Tell us just a little bit about that and how that would help people continue this conversation.
Todd, thanks so much for being a champion of what we do. and just your partnership. I'm going to put that on the screen. If you go to discipleship.org, you'll notice the online. We were going to do it live and in person in Phoenix. We've been doing it several years in a row here in Nashville. But this is a live forum on disciple making. The theme is King Jesus. And so we're going to have main stage presentations on April 29th. And then we have partners. And our partners, I just want to champion our partners. At Exponential, Todd, you do a great job of championing other church planting organizations. Likewise, we try to champion disciple-making organizations. So on your screen, you'll see 10 of our partners. We have about 30, but we just committed to use 10 of them in Phoenix, and now we made the decision to take the whole thing online. And so you can see these people. I mean, you're going to have guys like Jim Putman, like Bill Hall, Dan Spader, three of the top disciple-making networks and organizations, along with Exponential. So Exponential doing a session on disciple making and church planting and so forth. And here's the situation. It's a killer good deal. If you just want to attend the live forum, it's $39. If you want to attend the live forum and get a digital access pass to all of these sessions, you can do that for $60. I'm sorry, $79 is the combo. If you just want the digital access pass, it's $60.
Great. And that's coming up at the end of April. I'm going to ask our team to put up, some of you that haven't already accessed it, we want you to be able to get to this study. You can actually, for free, download this study. We'll put a slide up with the web address there, exponential.org/disciple-study. And you can instantly download this study that we've talked about on the call today. We're also going to ask, we'll put up another slide. We are in the middle right now, discipleship.org, Exponential, Catalyst, Leadership Network, a number of ministries are helping sponsor a survey of how churches are responding to COVID-19. This survey is only going to be open for a little bit more time. It's a simple 5-minute thing to complete. Ed Stetzer is going to be publishing a report off of this, thousands of churches taking the study, and we're going to be able, anybody who signs up to take the survey and says that they want to get the report, we'll be able to email you the report. So would encourage you to jump on and take 5 minutes to answer that survey. From what we've seen in the data so far, a lot of good things that will be, you'll be able to see how what you're doing compares to some other churches. So jump on, do that. Bobby, thank you for being with us. For all of our listeners, thanks for being on. And we'll follow up with people to get the link out for this webinar. So thank you, Bobby.
Todd, thank you so much. And I just can't tell everybody how much I appreciate you, your work at Exponential, and what a difference you're making. It's an honor to call you a close friend.
Well, same thing, Bobby. Thank you.